I'm Michael Woods. I'm a human geographer from Aberystwyth University, and I am one of the co-directors of WISERD. I've been involved in a number of things at WISERD. I've been involved with the localities project, and we were trying through that to think about particularly what a locality means, and we were interested in looking at how we imagine the boundaries of localities, but also how localities are linked into wider networks. The work I'm currently involved with is a project called the Global Countryside, Rural Change and Development and Globalization, and this is a 5-year study funded by the European Research Council. In this research, what we're looking at is how rural areas have been impacted by globalization, how globalization has changed the nature of rural localities, and how people in rural areas, rural communities, have responded to globalization. We start from a belief that globalisation is not something which is imposed top-down from above, but rather is something which actually is made through places, happens through places. And that gives opportunities to communities, to local businesses, rural businesses, to actually be involved in those processes and help shape the outcomes. In this project, we're looking at that through a number of different perspectives. So we're partly looking in detail at how those processes of change actually happen, and we're drawing on research there from around the world, in Wales, but also in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Sweden and Ireland. We're also, the second strand in the research, picking up on what we call everyday globalisation. And that is things like the way in which we are travelling further for holidays. We are eating more international food. And we're going to do that for a very detailed ethnographic study of Newtown in Mid Wales and think about the way in which everyday globalisation affects the lives of people in that town over the last few decades. A third part of the study is then looking at how emerging economies in China and Brazil are engaging with the global economy and the implications of that for rural areas and rural populations, which often have been impoverished compared to the cities in those countries. And then a final strand of research is going to be thinking about what we might call global challenges: climate change, food security, energy security, and how in finding responses to those great challenges, there's often implications for rural areas that it requires us to build, for example, wind farms in rural areas to address the challenge of climate change and energy security, and how does that fit in with people's imaginations of what it means to be in a rural area? How does that provoke conflict or tensions, and how do we resolve those? And then cross-cutting all of those themes, we have another element of the research which is going to be mapping and visualising these trends of globalisation, these processes of globalisation and their impacts. And from that we aim to produce a website which will be a public resource to people to go and use, schools, campaign groups, NGOs, use to get information about impacts of globalisation, but also to find good practice and best practice examples about how communities have been able to respond to those challenges. A lot of the previous research on globalisation has tended to focus on urban areas. We think of global cities like London and New York and Los Angeles. Rural areas have not been studied to the same extent, and yet they're critical to many of the globalisation processes happening. The globalisation of food and agriculture impacts on rural areas. Where research has been done, it's tended to focus on global networks, for example, following those supply chains for food, or on very focused examples. Where this project is really different and is innovative is in looking at different geographical locations, different parts of the world, but looking at the combined impact of economic globalisation, cultural globalisation and migration on those places. My interest in this area really came from doing previous research where we were comparing rural politics and rural policies in different countries, and noticing that globalisation was a common factor in the background in all those areas, but the responses were different. And it's really starting to think about why were the similar globalisation processes having different impacts, resulting in different outcomes in different parts of the world. I think this particular project will actually also help us to understand globalisation not just in a rural context, but more broadly. And I think grounding some of that evidence in Wales in particular is something we can look at more in WISERD, and particularly in thinking about some of the consequences for civil society, and for example how when we are many people's voluntary activity engagement in organisations now is not just framed around local activities, but often shaped by global interests, campaigning, being concerned about issues happening in other parts of the world, and the way in which those connections between local civil society and global civil society are perhaps being remade, redefined.